The nature of modern gaming means that a bad game doesn't need to be a bad game forever. It is entirely possible for committed devs to work hard to improve a title that just doesn't deliver the goods upon release. Perhaps the most famous example is No Man's Sky, which, despite launching embarrassingly feature poor, has surpassed just about everyone's expectations in the years since, even including a free VR update. Still, there are those games that are eventually patched into a superior state, and yet the player base has just moved on. Ultimately, updates which take months or even years to deliver what should have been released on launch often feel like a case of too little, too late, as is surely true of the following games. With that in mind, I'm Will for WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games that fixed themselves too late. 10. Batman Arkham Knight. Though the console versions of Rocksteady's Batman Arkham Knight were largely praised by critics, apart from the overuse of the Batmobile sequences obviously, the PC version was crapped on from all directions for its numerous technical issues, even rendering the game literally unplayable for some. Thousands of players reported frame rate dips as low as 10 FPS while gliding or driving the Batmobile, even on high-end systems, causing Warner Bros. To suspend sales of the game on PC just a single day after release. It wasn't until September 2015, more than 2 months after the game launched, that a substantial patch was released, and despite many players still reporting persistent technical issues, Warner Bros. Nevertheless restored Arkham Knight to PC storefronts in late October. The outcry was significant enough that full refunds were offered throughout 2015, and Warner Bros. Promised that they'd continue to release patches to fix the game. The sad fact is that many players simply sought their refund and never looked back, because when a developer releases a blatantly unfinished game and takes their sweet time fixing it, why on earth would you let them keep your money? 9. The Division. It would be unfair to call The Division a broken game on launch, but it was certainly a disappointment, with its huge open world feeling weirdly empty, and with Ubisoft offering up little to keep players engaged once the relatively brief campaign was done with. The lackluster endgame just wasn't what players had been promised, and so within 3 months of its March 2016 release, the PC player count was down a whopping 93%. But Ubisoft dug their heels in and refused to take a decisive L, delivering a glut of DLC, both paid and unpaid, culminating in the massive free 1.8 update, released in late 2017. This update delivered a new area of land, new PvP and PvE modes, smart revisions of the game's divisive rogue mechanics, and literally dozens of quality of life changes. 2 years after it launched, The Division was a very different game, with a greater emphasis on player customization, a satisfying loot loop, and a wholly more diverse array of content on offer. But it's also fair to say that almost 2 years is a long time to wait for a game from going from meh to great. And with murmurs by late 2017 that a Division sequel was on the way, many players simply opted to sit it out and wait for the follow-up release. 8. Ni no Kuni 2, Revenant Kingdom. Though it was largely well received by critics, Revenant Kingdom was one of 2018's biggest gaming disappointments. The most common complaint leveled against the JRPG was the ludicrously low difficulty level, ensuring that even on the highest difficulty at launch, battles were too easy to be much fun. Given that the previous game was decidedly more challenging, fans were outraged and vocally expressed their feedback, leading developers Level 5 to release a difficulty patch 3 months later, which finally added hard and expert difficulties to the game. The updates totally reinvigorated the combat, as the game went from offering no incentive for players to experiment to revealing the creative depths of its combat options when players were actually given some pushback. But taking 3 months to deliver some fairly basic mathematical alterations isn't exactly impressive, and given that many players had either beaten the game already or simply moved on out of boredom, it was the definition of too late. 7. Battlefield 4. Battlefield 4 had one of the most problematic launches of any FPS game in recent memory, with many players unable to consistently connect to games, and even when they could, the dodgy netcode clearly wasn't delivering the tight experience fans expected. Many affected players had to suffer through this for more than 6 months before EA finally released a substantial netcode fix, and EA was heavily criticized for still releasing DLC packs during the fiasco, as well as announcing the follow-up game Battlefield Hardline. EA eventually did deem Battlefield 4's problems unacceptable in an official statement and acknowledged that they'd damaged their relationship with players as a result. Though the game was in strong shape by mid-2015, some 18 months after its release, many players simply opted to get a refund and go back to the brilliant Battlefield 3 instead. 6. Diablo 3. Diablo 3's initial 2012 launch was, to be blunt, a freaking train wreck. The massively anticipated RPG was beset by two major issues: Blizzard insisting upon always online DRM, which left many players unable to play due to pervasive server issues, and an auction house which allowed players to buy loot with real money, in effect undermining the game's much-loved loot grind loop. Fans held nothing back, letting Blizzard know their distaste for these game-breaking features, and though Diablo 3 sadly never got an official offline mode, the server issues did subside in the weeks after launch. Meanwhile, the auction house unfortunately couldn't simply be turned off without further breaking the game's economy, but even so, it wasn't until June 2014, over 2 years after the game launched, that it was finally shut down. But Diablo 3 really did come into its own with the release of 2014's Reaper of Souls expansion, which introduced a new hero, raised the level cap, delivered major loot drop improvements, and basically gave players the game they should have had back in 2012. Between the absurd amount of time Blizzard took to fix Diablo 3 and the fact that they still dared to charge money for the expansion, a lot of crestfallen players had simply just moved on. 5. SimCity. 2013's SimCity reboot had one of the roughest launches of any game of the last decade, with many reviewers urging players not to buy the game due to its always online DRM, which, due to, once again, persistent server issues, would result in lost saves and a simple inability to actually play the game. The complaints were vociferous enough that Amazon temporarily removed the game from their storefront, while Maxis officially admitted that they didn't prepare enough servers to deal with player demand, requiring them to add more post-launch. Worse still, EA flatly refused to offer refunds to affected customers, resulting in disgruntled customers filing a petition with the White House regarding refund policies on always online games. EA released numerous patches to fix issues, though dismissed the notion of including an offline mode, something which players eventually discovered could be manually achieved by editing a single line of the game's code. EA finally relented and released an official mode in January 2014. Some 10 months after release, and that is case 5417 of EA being the frickin' worst. 4. Street Fighter V. Street Fighter V was quite rightly ripped apart by fans on launch, because while the core gameplay itself was as solid as ever, the beat-em-up hit stores with an embarrassingly lackluster amount of content. Between the lack of proper single-player story mode, an absurdly malnourished roster, and a frustratingly lack of instability, Street Fighter V didn't even deliver the basic goods on release, and fans were furious. Despite critics lavishing a baffling amount of praise on the game, fans were far less kind, noting that the launch product was blatantly unfinished. And even accepting the notorious loyalty of the fighting game community, fans actually voted somewhat with their wallets, resulting in the game falling below Capcom's first-year sales target. Almost 2 years after its original release, Capcom dropped a free Arcade Edition update, which added a more substantial story mode, arcade mode, new moves, and a heap of extra features for genre enthusiasts which clearly should have been ready for launch. Though Street Fighter V did eventually translate into sales success, 2 years is a long time to wait for a game to realize its potential. 3. Driveclub. Driveclub was announced the very same day that Sony unveiled the PS4 for the first time, and after initially being planned as a PS4 launch title, it eventually ended up releasing almost a year later in October 2014. Despite Evolution Studios talking up its groundbreaking online connectivity features, Driveclub launched with major online issues from the jump, with players unable to even connect to the game's servers, let alone actually compete against others. Driveclub quickly became a laughingstock among gamers, and its connectivity issues weren't fully fixed until many months after its launch. To Evolution's credit, they consequently festooned players with heaps of free updates, adding dynamic weather among other requested features, ultimately supporting the game with patches for over 18 months, even releasing a final patch many months after Sony had actually shuttered the studio. In the years following its launch, Driveclub has evolved into a genuinely strong racing game, though only the hardcore faithful stuck around to figure this out. 2. Aliens Colonial Marines. Aliens Colonial Marines is one of the most disappointing games of the last decade, offering up a totally mediocre riff on James Cameron's sci-fi horror classic movie, defined by a mediocre story, terrible voice acting, and most offensively, laughably poor AI and glitches. The game came under greater scrutiny once it was revealed that developer Gearbox Software outsourced much of its game's development, and the end product was one of significantly lower quality than implied by earlier gameplay videos. Though Gearbox released a 4GB patch to fix some of the issues a month after release, it wasn't until 2017 that many of the problematic AI routines were fixed, by a player tweaking a single line of code. That's right, over 4 years after Colonial Marines hit stores, a modder discovered that the game's janky AI was caused by a typo in the code, which, with a simple tweak, immediately made the xenomorphs behave like, actual xenomorphs. The fact that the developers themselves didn't notice this during production, nor managed to fix it in the 4 years since its release, is nothing short of embarrassing. 1. Brink. Brink was one of the most anticipated FPS games of the last decade, arriving on a tidal wave of hype back in 2011 with hope that its emphasis on parkour-inspired movement would truly shake the genre up. And yet, Brink released to a lukewarm response from critics and fans alike, with much criticism leveled at not only its shallow gameplay, but especially its unreliable multiplayer connectivity. In a desperate attempt to stem player anger, developer Splash Damage quickly introduced a 4v4 multiplayer mode for players experiencing lag during 8v8, but it wasn't until August, 3 months later, that the much-hyped Agents of Change DLC finally arrived and truly changed the game. This DLC smoothed over most all of the online issues, improved NPC AI, rebalanced weapons, added new maps, weapons, and outfits, and also raised the level cap. But the sad fact is that Brink's player base died off almost instantly. Within a year of its release, Brink's concurrent player count was down to less than 100, despite being a much better game by that point. Clearly, players felt too burned to give it a second chance. And there you have it, folks, 10 video games that fixed themselves too late. Feel free to drop this video a like if you enjoyed it, and drop me a follow on Twitter at @USlyDogU. I'm Will for WhatCulture, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.